All right, so welcome. This is the last week, of course, and we're doing hardware. Um, this is Dr. Julian Chambliss. He's at Michigan State University. He has a lot of titles. He's in history, English, I think, and maybe even the museum. He's a comic scholar, done a lot of work on comics, racing comics, and other issues. And that's why I'm having him here today, specifically to talk about hardware and milestone a little bit. So welcome, Julian. It's good to see
Oh,
you.
thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me.
And we could totally, of course, go off the rails and go deep into comics and things like that. But we need to keep this kind of on the surface and maybe have some references here and there to comics. But
Right. So let me start by saying because I feel like this might be helpful a little bit and also to my own horn as you indicated, I'm a curator. I'm the Val Berriman curator at the MSU Museum. I do have a show about Afrofuturism in comics, a virtual show that's available right now called Beyond the Black Panther: Visions of Afrofuturism in Comics. That is available. So if you type in Beyond the Black Panther MSU Museum in your Google, it'll come up and you can see. Yeah, that's it.
and what I'll
So
do is I'll provide a link for this in the module because you can
right,
actually virtually tour it and actually see the whole exhibit.
right, yeah, it's a virtual pandemic, kids, pandemic. But that's inspired by uh, like you, um, me going back and rereading Mark Derry's original essay where he defines Afrofuturism, which is really an interview with Samuel Delaney, Greg Tate, and Trisha Rose. And I was really going back to those paragraphs where he defines Afrofuturism and recognizing, as comic scholar John Jennings indicated, like in the origin story for Afrofuturism, comics is right there. Hardware
Right.
is actually one of the visual references that he uses in that essay. And I was uh, remembering that and thinking about this in the context of comic studies, and why is it that again, in a field that is very dynamic, that is comic studies, this sort of origin narrative associated with Afrofuturism in comics isn't talked about more often. There is the work by Ronaldo Anderson and that book. I think it's either Afrofuturism 2.0 or it's Black in the
I think,
Ink. I think it's Black in the Ink, actually, where he does this sort of Afrofuturist, critical Afrofuturist reading
oh yeah,
of
that's in in
uh,
Jennings and Gatewards.
right. Yeah, it's Black in the Ink. Uh, and so the thought for me is that I think a lot of people have not made this, an emphasis in their work, in part because comics are a juvenile medium. Like there's a sort of cultural baggage, and I think about this in light of a great point that I'll do they Nama, I'm butchering his name, I'm so sorry, made in some of his work where he was writing about science fiction film in the 1950s, that images of Black people are really rooted in like region history and assumptions that white people have about Black people, right? And
And
so,
that's partly what happens in this essay with Derry and Delaney too.
right, and so when you're trying to think about kind of Black futurism in comics, you any sort of like black future narrative, I think, is weighted down by these questions of like region, race, and culture that white people have about Black people. But if you use an Afrofuturist lens, I think you can really see like, well, there are really strong Afrofuturist narratives in comics that are produced by Black people.
Right.
And we can sort of see them if we use a sort of Afrofuturist framework. And of course, I think hardware is one that is easy to see because Milestone, I think, had a really strong sort of Black counterpublic mission at its core. Although I don't know that necessarily the creators would have understood it or described it that way, but I tend to think of it that way because there are a lot of things that are happening in Milestone as a publication series, like the publication company, that correspond with Afrofuturism. Like, Afrofuturism is not just simply about the future; it's also about the past. So when you look at Milestone and you look at the stories that they wrote, they're very referential to a Black cultural historical past,
Right.
and bringing key figures and key concepts and key desires associated with the African American experience, and integrating them seamlessly into this imaginary world that is the Dakotaverse. And Dakota itself, I think, always as a comic version of Detroit.
Yeah.
I've always made this like,
The
Dakota is
Midwest
Detroit,
not New York.
not New York. It is Detroit, right? It's Detroit, which of course is an African American, a city with a very strong African American past, and elements of being a stop on the Underground Railroad, and a place where African Americans have deep cultural roots. Um, work across different fields in terms of being innovative leaders and so on and so forth. And so when we think about a Milestone as a both a sort of publication entity created in a moment, again, in the 1990s, where I think that was a historical moment where questions of race, culture, and politics were really front of mind, right? We remember this was the moment where we're having real debates about multiculturalism in the early 1990s, and the quote unquote culture wars.
Right. I remember
The
this
race,
start for them. This is the start of gangster rap for one. I mean, hip hop
right? Yeah,
exploding on everything with NWA, Dr. Dre, and all that. What year was Rodney King as well? I mean,
that
that
was
was
like
93, right?
1992,
That was
92,
92.
92, 93.
So the Rodney King verdict, the things that happened in Los Angeles and places like that. So yeah, so that's a moment that's I think important, and also Milestone itself is important because they don't know anything about Milestone. I mean, Milestone is the first Black-owned, basically large comics publication, right?
Well, I think,
not the first Black comics, but the first.
well, there were other independent Black comic book company before Milestone. There's a great issue of actually the Comics Journal that if you're interested, you can go back. There were publications, initiatives like ANIIA, I think was the name of the company, but those are primarily very small, independent comic producers that were not, in many ways, not effective in terms of the mainstream. And I say that not as a criticism of them, but as a reality. To get into the distribution system of comics from a structural standpoint, like we talk about this, a structural standpoint, you have to have pre-orders to be in a direct market. These are comic books that are not they don't have pre-orders. They are being sold at conventions. They're being sold in sort of like a one-on-one, small retail, small cultural spaces. The biggest success prior to Milestone arguably would be Brotherman Comics of the early 1990s. And again, but the Sims brothers, they were in some ways master marketers. They tapped into alternative Black literary spaces, bookstores, Black bookstores, Black barbershops, Black churches, to distribute their material. So they actually identify a different distribution framework that catered to Black spaces, and that's why they were able to sell so many comics. Whereas some of these earlier small press independent comics, they are not nearly as successful. They might be regionally successful, and they benefit from the emergence of a sort of like Black comic book spaces that are coming online at that time. But they are in no way, shape, or form successful like Milestone, because Milestone was made up of creators who had broken in to the mainstream comic market and knew how it worked, and so created in many ways, a kind of proto image. If you think about the way Image Comic operates right now, right? Like, it's a company, create their own work, and they're able to position people who come in with their work and get them distribution, editorial, marketing support. Milestone was that. They crafted the deal with DC to distribute their work, and that immediately got them access to an infrastructure that meant that their work would get out there, and so you could see it in places that many of these smaller presses would never be seen.
I think that's what's important, because when you were talking, what I was thinking about, of course, that connection with DC, but they were international. I mean, you could find them in comic book stores everywhere. I've told you this, I found some of my first issues of Icon when I went to a comic book store in Scotland. Okay. Most of my Milestone collection, so of Icon, Blood Syndicate, my static books, my hardware books, I've bought them up in rural Northeast Georgia.
Right.
Which is when you think about demographics and all that, it's really kind of interesting to think that I found the first 10 issues of Icon and probably about 10 more. So about 20 issues of Icon up here. I found 2 issues of Hardware #1 in the antique store up here.
Right.
So just to tell you kind of the reach they had, if I was going looking for Brother Man, I'd have to order online,
right,
or something along
those lines. It would be very hard. It'd be very hard to find issues of Brother Man. I mean, you can find actually collected editions of Brother Man on Amazon, things like that. But yeah, you're right. Like, what you're describing is the reality of like those comics being in the direct market. So every comic book shop, anywhere, gets previews and they can order that comic. And so yeah, you can find it in back bins around the country. I mean, I can go into any comic book shop anywhere in the country and probably find, and if they still got back issues, which is increasingly complicated for a lot of comic book shops, you can find copies of Milestone comics in there.
Mm-hmm.
You're gonna find some.
And Milestone for students, Milestone was important. I mean, up to this point, you wouldn't have, there wasn't a black author, a black writer of Black Panther until 1998. I mean, keep that in mind. Black Panther had been around since the 1960s, right?
Right.
And think about how huge that film was with representation. That's what Milestone was in the early 90s, I would say. And of course, I didn't come to Milestone until later, but Joseph Illich posted this in February about hardware. And he actually worked for Milestone, started as an intern, and then became part of the company. But one of the best first issues of a superhero comic book series ever produced in the American direct market is, in his opinion, hardware. And personally, I tend to agree with him. There are some misses, I think, in that issue, but overall, that's probably one of the best first issues, I think, of any series. And we need to discuss, of course, what makes it a best issue. But before we do that, I kind of want to give you a little background on Dwayne McDuffie, who's huge in the comics industry. There's actually, what's the award named after him? The Dwayne McDuffie what?
Is it the Dwayne McDuffie like representation or multicultural award? I think it is.
I don't remember, but there's a huge award in the comics industry named after him for representation. And he was a comic book writer for Marvel and DC before they started Milestone. Milestone, I think, was started by 5 guys. Dennis Cowan, who of course did some of the artwork for some of these issues, was in there too.
Yeah, it's the Wayne McDuffie Award for Diversity in Comics. Okay. That's what it's called. Yeah.
But he had a run on a series called Deathlock, which is where I really kind of got introduced to McDuffie. And I want to give you this quote from this is actually an interview we did with Evan. I can't pronounce his last name. Narcisse.
Oh yeah, I know who you're talking about.
Who actually writes a really good run of the Black Panther. But this was in 2010, and McDuffie unfortunately has passed away since then. But Evan asked him, "Your run on Deathlock seemed to be full of allusions to the Black experience." And if you read, when you've read Hardware, you see these allusions, and we're going to talk about those a little bit. These are things you can talk with your students about. And I know that some of the issues that you read, I would not use in the K-12 setting. Maybe not definitely not in the K-12 setting. But I'm thinking issues 1, 2, and possibly issue 8 are issues that you could use in a K-12 setting to actually talk about illusions and influence. But Evan asked him, like I said, your run on Deathlock seemed to be full of illusions with lack of experience. The lead character is trapped in a cyborg construct. He's a cyborg and has his body stolen from him. He's a black man who has his body stolen from him. There are multiple Deathlocks throughout publication, but his fear and shame at how his family would see him would see his new form keeps him from them. And it's written kind of in letters too. He actually writes letters to his wife.
Right.
He's literally separated from his own humanity. And the dialogues between the cyborg's computer AI and Michael Collins riffs on the two-ness that W.E.B. Du Bois spoke about, the double consciousness. If I remember correctly, we talked about double consciousness earlier in the semester. How much of this was explicitly in your and Greg Wright's pitch, and how much did you slip under the radar? And this is what's important right here. The ways that, and Delaney talks about this with science fiction in his interview with Gary, about politics and influence and history too.
Right.
But McDuffie said none of it was in the pitch, but all of it was intentional. Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which we need to talk about with Hardware, was and still is my favorite novel. And remember, Greg Tate mentioned that Invisible Man could be Afrofuturist. We can think about it in those terms if you've read that novel. He said, I just read The Souls of Black Folks, which is Du Bois, and where Du Bois expresses double consciousness, talks about it. And was explicitly thinking about Henry Louis Gates as a signifying monkey. Godel, Escher, Bach, and Derek Bell's dialogues about race. And Derek Bell, of course, father of critical race theory, if you want to look at it that way. Race and law sort of crashed in my head. Deathlock was a way of sharing some of my thoughts. So McDuffie is very much imbuing these comics with these discussions. And you can see it in Deathlock. This is from issue number 2. And this run is called The Souls of Cyberfolk, which is a play on the souls of black folk. And Michael Collins is Deathlock here, and he's talking to Misty Knight, if you've seen her. She has a cybernetic arm.
Right.
He's a private detective. But there's some interesting things going on here, because she's talking to him about language and being referred to as a cyborg or cybernet, right? And the derogatory nature that language is used. And Collins says, control the language right here, control the terms of debate. I'm familiar with the tactic. How do you guys know about me though? Okay. This is all early on when they're talking, they're setting up this conversation. And she keeps talking about the language and all this, and about how to refer to him, you know, whether cyborg or cybernet. Cyborg is derogatory. And then they get to the point of names, and you know, he says, don't call me Deathlock. Right? My name is Michael. So his identity and who he is in his name. And the reason I point that out is all this leads up to, they have a little altercation with some people. They go back to Misty Knight's apartment to finish the conversation. And all this leads up to this discussion right here. Let me see exactly where it is real quick so I can find it. So they're talking about her partner. And then she says, it's like being trapped between two worlds, at least two. And then look at what Collins quotes. He quotes Du Bois' double consciousness. It's a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of the world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels this two-ness, two souls, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body. And I see Du Bois' double consciousness dealing with art too, specifically if you look at this quote. And then of course they talk about Du Bois and double consciousness. That's what's going on here in the story of a cyborg or a cybernet, right? Is these discussions of race. And these come up too in some other milestone series. This is Icon that Gary talks about a little bit more at length in the essay you read. But there's a scene in here too at the end. Hopefully it'll work. Raquel, who is his sidekick, who actually tells him to be Icon, wants to be like Toni Morrison. But there's a scene at the end of the first issue right here, where they meet on the bridge that's been destroyed. And then she's reading, the black race, like all races, is going to be saved by its exceptional men. It is the problem of developing the best of this race, that they may guide the mass away from the contamination and death of the worst in their own and other races. She's quoting Du Bois. Du Bois is the talented 10th. And then Augustus Freeman says he's more of a Booker T. Washington man himself. And you see that within the narrative. But the debates, the Black intellectual debates of the early 1900s that still continue, of course, are there in that series, in this work. So the importance of thinking about comics, like Julian was talking about earlier, not as something that's less than, but something that informs and that adds to all these discussions. Anything you want to add to that real quick before we move on? I just did a lot.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that, one of the things that Dwayne McDuffie talked about a lot was that Milestone was not a Black comic book company.
Right.
It was a multiracial comic book company, and the intention in the stories were to tell a realistic take on a world that he grew up in, that he lived in. And I think one of the things that's really meaningful in a lot of his work is these sort of different ideological strands representing Black thought that creep into the landscape, right? So Icon is a Black conservative. And so like, this sort of dichotomy between Du Bois is sort of like Black radical ideological tradition versus Washington's Black radical ideological position, because I would argue both of them from the standpoint of white people are problematic, right? From the standpoint of Black people, what politics was successful is being judged through like different historical lenses, but both were techniques that were being adopted by Black people in the early 20th century, right? And I think it's important to recognize that this idea that a Black conservatism doesn't work, or a Black radicalism did work, is missing the point that like there are multiple ways that Black people are trying to seek a better future. And that's really important, right? It's not a monolithic set of ideologies. It's actually a pluralism in political cultural thought, and arts are an important part of that. I mean, this was one of the battlegrounds around this idea of using it as a kind of public tool, like as a way to speak against or work against white supremacy. So I think it's interesting to think about, again, the complexity of comics as a juvenile, often seen as a juvenile form, but in the context of African Americans trying to tell stories in that form, they are working against a longer legacy that is marginalizing Blackness and often relying on, I think, really sophisticated set of ideological constructs to achieve that.
Yeah, I mean, you trace all of this back to literature before even comics, which I would too. Isaiah Lavender does too, right?
Right.
And I think about Derry's first quote there. I mean, from Orwell. I mean, it's from George
Right.
Orwell, for crying out loud. I'm trying to get to where share my screen real quick. Give me 1 second. Sorry. So, I mean, that quote, of course, is, I can't share it, but, who controls the past? I think this might be before. Ran the party slogan, controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past.
Right.
And then,
and I think from a theoretical standpoint, a lot of theorists are concerned about this idea of the past, right? I mean, I think Kojo Oshun piece on that's really meaningful to me, his piece on further reflection on Afrofuturism, he spends a good deal of time talking about the control of the future that is rooted in a manipulation of the past. I mean, this is why the sort of critical race theory's emphasis on counter storytelling and storytelling in the context of trying to liberate, I think, should be understood as not some sort of ironic, irrational, creative thing. The fact of the matter is that white people or the mainstream society has employed a kind of storytelling, and then in some moments, really regressively, a kind of storytelling that facilitates oppression, right? And so that colonization of the past is important to maintain and control in the present. and projecting that control into the future. And so the battleground of the past has to be, you know, the past is a battleground that has to be leveraged in these imaginary narratives, both in terms of recovering positive examples, but also in terms of like being critical of the structures of the past that led you to uneven presence that you want to disrupt as you think about a more progressive future. And so when you start thinking about this in terms of literature, there's a lot of recovery work that I think Afrofuturists point to, these texts that have Afrofuturist themes, characters, structures in them, but may not have been understood as Afrofuturism, right? And there, you know, Sutton Griggs with his work Imperial and Imperium, Pauline Hopkins, right? You know, it's helpful that you have someone like Du Bois who wrote everything. And of course, he wrote science fiction too. So he's an Afrofuturist, but there's so many other works, you know, Light Ahead for the Negro, you know, The Black Sleuth that fit within these structures. And so we have a kind of like literary pedigree around Afrofuturism, and that pedigree, that speculative fiction pedigree, is alongside a more traditional kind of like Black excellence, Black art, talented kind of thing, where African Americans are seeking to produce work that is exactly like, but better than what white people produce.
Frank Darabont.
Like Frank Darabont, right? And so, you know,
well,
it's a complicated.
They're trying to move away from race, right?
Right. They're trying to move away. Well, and in part, you know, and if a Black person produces a work that is indistinguishable but superior to a white person, then many critiques and assumptions that white people make about Blackness are wrong. Right? Like that's the reason why, you know, a kind of Harlem Renaissance, Alan Locke approach, you know, the sort of talent tenth approach matters. There's real challenges to that, because like racism is not rational. It's irrational. Right? Like it highly malleable and it's irrational. So just being successful at, like, you know, telling a different kind of story might not be enough realistically, and that becomes I think a challenging reality for so many people.
And that's why I think, I mean, the second quote I was going to say too was Elaine Locke's right here. There's nothing more galvanizing than the sense of the cultural past, which,
right.
If you remember last week, we talked and we looked a little bit at Brown Gordon Dreaming and the way that Jacqueline Woodson actually reconstructs the past too and talks about that. So let's get into hardware real quick. So I know we don't have much time, but I mean, from the outset, we've talked about, in this class, we've talked about capitalism a little bit in relation to Ernest Gaines as a Gathering of All Men. And this comic is straight up saying that Curtis Metcalf is a cog in the machine. It is a critique of capitalism, a not so veiled critique from the outset, right?
Right.
There's a lot going on, of course, semiotically with his outfit that we do not have time to talk about. I kind of see it a little bit in relation to Luke Cage with
right.
the belt, but now the belt being used as a weapon. But that's a whole other issue that we can't talk about right now.
And, you know, and I also think it's important to recognize that hardware like coats himself in a shell, a black shell, right? Which I've always thought is like really interesting. To sort of think about a black man encoding himself in a black shell, and what's the symbolism there? Like armoring himself, like is the black skin a kind of armor? I mean, that is often one of the critiques about how black people are presented in popular culture, right? Like the black skin is this sort of like non-human thing.
Well, the braggadocio of hip hop, right? Partly.
Well, I think that's a different
hyper-masculine image is what I'm thinking about.
Right. Yeah. And that hyper-masculine image, but you know, it connects back to like the buck, right? Like it's super powerful. And so this is that, but transformed, because there's actually like a really sophisticated mind behind the creation of this shell.
Right. Because he's using this protection.
He's using it as protection, right? Like, so he's creating a kind of protection rooted in blackness. And you can read this first issue, I think, very much as like, even the title Angry Black Man um is a bit of a parody, right? Like his anger as you read the issue is justified. So that charge that black people are angry is often leveled by white people because they want to reject black anger, right? Like they want to reject black women being angry. They want to reject black people, black men being angry. And they just say, well, you're just an angry black man, as opposed to like when white people get angry, this is very important. Like there must be something wrong. It's almost always the opposite when black people are angry. And so when you're seeing um, Hardware's first issue, you're being led through a kind of exploration of the nature of systemic oppression and how it makes black people angry. And then you see in a person, basically wrestling agency using his mind to fight against that, which is in some level a very classic sort of African American narrative, right? Like
I mean,
you have to think past these things somehow.
the whole thing, I mean, I know this is really simplistic, but the whole thing reminds me of Invisible Man.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
there are material illusions. And I was rereading some of Invisible Man just for a piece I did. I need to reread that novel. It's been a little while, but he's very active because he says, Invisible Man says at one point, what does he say? I wrote a blog post about it that I can post for y'all on the app. But he says in the intro, where is it? When he's talking hibernation. So from the outset of Ellison's novel, the Invisible Man says he believes, quote, in nothing but action, and that his hibernation is a covert preparation for a more overt action, which is what Metcalf does, right? I mean, he uses Alva's tools against him in the basement, and Invisible Man is in the underground too. And at the end of the novel, Invisible Man says this, he talks about why he wrote his story, torturing himself in the process. He tells the reader, quote, because in spite of myself, I've learned some things. Without the possibility of action, all knowledge comes to one labeled file and forget. And I can never file nor forget. And that plays right into what you're talking about with Metcalf, of course, being wronged, and then the anger being a result of that, or a response to that being wronged by Alva and the system. Nor will certain ideas forget me. They keep filing away at my lethargy, my complacency. And I guess, like I said, it's been so long since I've read Invisible Man. It never really clicked with me that he is in that opening at that end talking about action.
Right.
Because he seems to be retreating, because he's, siphoning power from the power company and all that stuff too. But that gets into, of course, the other literary illusion here, which is the bird, the caged bird.
Right.
Which has a long tradition. You probably know I know why the caged bird sings from Maya Angelou's, book. But the earliest reference I know of, there's probably earlier ones, but is Paul Laurence Dunbar's Sympathy, which this is a perfect poem to use with those opening few pages. And you notice the parakeet pops up again and again. Metcalf even gets a parakeet, I think in issue 7 or 8, to remind him. And you were talking about that a little bit earlier. How do you see this opening with the caged bird? It's not necessarily just caged in the glass ceiling, but it's something more, which is what I think Dunbar's Sympathy talks about.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this idea that there is an invisible structure that is holding you down isn't just simply the corporate glass ceiling, right? Like, the idea that Curtis is a cog in the machine, but also like a systemic set of structures that Derry refers to in the original article, where he says like there are these invisible force fields that prevent you and control, that prevent control African Americans. And when you're looking at that opening scene, that's a meta narrative, right? Like the narrative of the glass ceiling, but then there's the bigger narrative in the story of like an invisible set of controls that you don't understand, that Curtis starts to understand, both in terms of like, my boss isn't just simply my boss, he's also a criminal mastermind, which in a sense becomes like the system isn't going to help me, even though I have done everything possible as a person of color. Like I am a super accomplished person. Like he has like 18, you know, numerous PhDs and is a inventive genius and so on and so forth. In order for him to be made right, he has to take action. And part of the journey of hardware, I would argue, is that he starts from a place of unaware, not being aware of his blackness and being angry, having sort of discovered the totality of the oppression that he's dealing with, and then goes through a process of like connecting back with himself. That this effort of assimilation that was the whole part of his life that you sort of see in flashback, which not because he came from a bad family, he didn't.
Yeah.
Not because he was homeless, he
That's a
wasn't.
whole other thing that
Right? Yeah,
talk
like
about.
yeah. Instead, he was just trying to be like Alva. He was trying to be what that invisible system said you needed to be respected and honest and great and good. And he did all that, and he's not respected, and he's working for a dishonest man, and he's trapped in a system that, in order for there to be justice, there needs to be some sort of break. And you can think about hardware as like a vigilante superhero story, but also is a story of radical readjustment of the system. And it's meaningful that the bad guys in hardware are called the system.
Yeah.
Right? He's fighting the system.
You can, I think, as you were talking there, I think you can think about it in partly in relation to Augustus Freeman and Icon, who was Icon, right?
Right. Yeah.
Even though Freeman doesn't have, he has this moment where he realizes that his conservatism isn't good for basically a lot of people. So his narrative arc is a little bit different, but it's kind of a similar thing.
Yeah. Well, and again, this goes back to like a classic, reality of African American political and cultural life, right? I think back to Henry Louis Gates, where he's sort of talking about different spaces and places related to African Americans fighting for freedom, right? Like there's always been a sort of back and forth. It's not one way, there's many ways, right? And some of these ways, though we celebrate in our dominant culture as a kind of, well, this is the way that worked, right? Like we think about the boys and the NAACP and their work. It's like, well, that was the one that work. Where we think about Booker T. Washington and his more conservative approach is failing. But the reality is that they were operating at different moments. And at the moment that Washington was operating, that more retrenchment, conservatism, internalized system made more sense than really 20 years later when W.B. Du Bois is really working with creating an NAACP, thinking about a global Pan-Africanism in a way where there's like, bigger structural issues on a global scale, destabilizing colonial control and creating these opportunities for someone like Du Bois to appeal of Black people to the UN, or to be involved for 20 years with the NAACP and its legal redress committee. So, the circumstances that people are facing are different, and the tools become different. And Ronaldo Anderson talks about Afrofuturism is a set of tools that people are using on the ground to deal with the questions that they are facing right then.
Well, and that's important because as Derry and Tate and actually all Delaney and all of them talk about, that's what hip hop, graffiti, all of these things on the ground, right? I found it really, we don't have time to talk about this. There are two things I want to do. I found it really interesting with Derry talking about the semiotics of technology, and I was like, I can't determine within my head if that's a stretch or if he's right. And part of me wants to say he's right now that I think back on it. but it was a really interesting kind of discussion about, the semiotics of why is the Walkman and the, Discman, why are they black, right? And why is the home computer white? I was like, that's really kind of an interesting thing to think about, because he's pushing back on Derry's comment about found technology and things like that. But anyways, the thing I want to wrap up with is, and we don't have time to talk about, like I said, but issue 8, one thing that I think students need to keep in mind too, issue 8, I think is phenomenal. Cowan doesn't do the art here, forgot who does it, but it's playing on trickster tales and Brer Rabbit, and I don't think she mentions a Nancy and all of them, but it's playing on African American trickster tales, right? But we haven't even talked about the fact that his love interest is a professor of African American studies, right? And that's an important thing too, worth discussion. But for my students, I think issue 8 is also a good issue, thinking about the ways culture influences, because you have an Oprah character, you have a funeral, you have the discussions of the trickster. This is kind of what Julian was talking about, of Curtis dealing with these issues, because what sparks this is, of course, the guys that he kills, the guys' arms that he chops off, and all
the horrible things that he does.
Right. So there's a lot more we could talk about here, but I know we've given you a lot. So thank you for joining me.
Oh yeah, no problem. It's always great to talk about comics, and I would say, just have them read your blog.
Yeah, I'm gonna post those 2 blogs on there about that. All right, I'm gonna share.
All right, thanks a lot.